We're live in Melbourne tonight in a week where there is so much going on in sport. James Hird, put your hands up if you think James Hird should be back as Essendon coach. Hands up. Ooh, James, I hope you're not watching. Who deserves a second chance? Dave Warner, Tim Payne, who is included? Welcome to Q&A. Thank you very much for that welcome. I'm Stan Grant. Now, if you want answers on transgender athletes, racism and religion in sport, we've got the panel for you. Chief Executive of the Australian Sports Commission, Kieren Perkins, handball player Hannah Mouncey, former NRL player and mental health advocate Joe Williams, sports lawyer from the University of Canberra, Catherine Ordway, and Pacific Sport consultant David Lakisa, who works closely with the NRL. Joining us a little later, Australian Commonwealth Games gold medalist Deborah Lovely-Atkinson, who has some strong views about inclusion. Please make them all feel welcome. As always, you can live stream us around the country on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quandra is the hashtag. Of course you'll get involved. And to get us started tonight, here's Tim Cronin. Tim?
The Essendon Football Club sacked coach Ben Rutten on Sunday. The reporting around the speculated return of former coach James Hird to the club seems to suggest that the AFL world is not yet ready to forgive Hird for his role in the 2013 supplement saga. It has been said that there's always a path to redemption in sport. Why is the AFL world able to forgive when it comes to assault convictions or allegations of domestic violence, but not in the case of James Hird?
Kieren.
Look, it's always challenging because there's a lot of emotion that sits around these things. You know, if you're an Essendon supporter, you've probably got a strong view compared to what somebody else might think. I have no general problem with the view of redemption, especially with young people. Young people make silly mistakes, they do stupid things, and their ability to learn from those mistakes and rehabilitate and move on is fine. I think where this particular issue has probably caused a little bit of pause and challenge for people is that are we willing to accept that winning at all costs comes with no consequence and invite that back in?
Hannah Mouncey, you had played Australian rules football. How do you feel about James Hird, if indeed he does come back to Essendon?
To be honest, I don't have any real feeling either way. I think people make mistakes and, you know, he's definitely, if he takes on the job, if he's appointed to the job, he's going to be in a much better position now as a result of the mistakes he made to be able to do a better job as coach. But at the same time, doping is probably that one thing in sport, well, it is that one thing in sport that is unforgivable. And, you know, that's not to say, I mean, he says he didn't know about it. You know, who's to know what the real answer is? And I think that's where the conflict arises, is that there are a lot of things people will forgive, but doping is the one that's not. And for some reason, it does extend to assault convictions and things, as you've mentioned, which I don't think it should either. But it's where we're at.
Gee, it was complicated, Catherine, because the case itself, it's still going on. The 34 players who were saying that they want to prove their innocence, they're still fighting for that. James Hird was never actually found guilty of doping. It was a governance issue that put him out of the sport. So having followed it so closely, being an expert in doping, looking at sports law, where do you sit on this question of James Hird coming back?
I think the redemption point is a really important one because everybody does deserve a second chance, I think. Even in a doping case, I think it's important to think about that life is long and people do make mistakes. This is a bit different, I think, because there's no feeling of wrongdoing and making good in this category. So I think that what we see traditionally in sport is that men muck up quite a lot more than women do in sport, and they often get a second chance, third chance, fourth chance. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see James in different roles, but is it a good idea to be going back to an old role? I'm not sure that would serve him in terms of growth in any event.
Maybe something that he's pondering right now. Tim, how do you feel about this? When you look at ethics and values in sport, your own ethics and values, do you feel disappointed? Do you feel let down by sport?
Yeah, I do, and I feel like I've been increasingly finding it difficult to reconcile my own values and positions and ideologies with sport as I've got older. I find it hard to see the way that James Hird's been treated when, we've been given a different standard in relation to players or otherwise, where there has been, assault convictions or domestic violence. It's
So you'd like to see... You grew up in an Essendon family, right?
Yeah.
You're pretty crazy, mad supporters of Essendon. Is that how you describe it?
Oh, I guess as a child maybe, but I find...
So do you feel that if he was to come back, how would you feel about that? Is he the answer? Because there's been so much turmoil at Essendon, hasn't there?
Yeah, I don't know, but to be honest, I don't know who would want to coach the club.
That's a good way to start. Well, let's get on to our next question. It comes from Nick Turvey.
Thanks, Dan. We have been appalled at the unethical behaviour of many sporting and political leaders, from the Cape Town sandpaper cricket scandal to the Essendon Football Club supplement scandal, and more recently, that sacking that we've just mentioned, in the most undignified and disrespectful way. More recently, we were horrified by Scott Morrison's underhanded secrecy about his multi-ministerial self-appointments. If our leaders can't behave ethically, how can our young people see it modelled?
Joe.
Thanks for coming to me for this one, Steve.
Politics and sport.
Look, I think, everything... We need to show leadership to our young people, and we can't... I'm in the game of behaviours, right? And young people young people copy what they see, right? So if we're seeing from our leaders of the country, if we're seeing from the leaders of coaching and sporting teams, not so great behaviour, how on earth can we expect change with our young people around these types of issues? We looked at some of the challenges that were mentioned in the last question. These people, let's call it for what it is. Sport for a lot of these people is a job, one, but they are put on a pedestal, and behaviours are often under the microscope. So we just have to see and have good leadership modelled by people in these leadership positions. Otherwise, our kids and our next generations are just going to follow the same poor behaviours.
Is there also a question, David Lakisa, that in the case of David Warner, there's been some time now since Sandpaper Gate, that period has been served, if you like. Would you welcome him back into a leadership position? As a fan of cricket, would you want to see that?
Nick, that's a great question, because it dovetails directly into piggybacks onto Tim's question of how many chances, whether it's a second or a third or a fourth opportunity at redemption. But off the back of Joe's comment, Nick, about that unethical behavioural modelling, we live, when we deal with moral, in a moral society, we're always going to be let down by one's behaviours and others. And that's why leadership is so important. But I'm a fan of ensuring leadership starts within the four walls of our own home. It starts within ourselves, within those we associate with, and being involved in coaching at the junior level. There's such a array of experiences from our young people. I remember one team I was coaching, one was dealing with bullying at school, another one was dealing with the parents being separated, another was dealing with with anger issues. And so we've got to be very, very mindful that while we esteem other people in certain roles, albeit leadership, that we've got to be mindful of where we stand as well in terms of how we want to lead, if that makes sense.
Kieren, it does come back to this, and you hear this a lot about role modelling. What is the responsibility of an athlete when it comes to being a good role model? Or is it just to perform? Is it just to go out and play well?
Oh, look, I think personally I fall a little bit on Joe's side of that. My view is that you are a role model and you have a responsibility. And we do hear this in the dialogue a lot. But, they're just young, they're an athlete, they didn't ask for this attention or this microscope. Well, what world were you living in where you didn't think that if you became elite and you became an employed member of a professional code, that there wouldn't be a spotlight on you.
Should you be held to a higher account than the Prime Minister, for instance? So, I mean, I know that John Howard said that being Australian cricket captain's the second highest honour in Australia, but...
Been a pretty low bar for a while.
What, in politics and sport? Or?
I'd actually put it the other way. I don't think anybody in sport should be held to any lesser account than the average person in the country. And that to me is where really some of this starts to get a little bit lost along the way, because we do come here tonight and have this conversation as though there is some deification of athletes because they apparently are better, different, I don't know. Being one, having been one, I probably should know, but I spent most of my athletic career thinking that I'm just a normal human being, and if it's good for one person, it's good for me. I think where we then get into trouble, of course, is because your question about, you know, behaviour from other members of the leadership class in the country. Well, you know, let's not hold people to account to a poor example that we don't agree with it in the get-go. Yeah, and Catherine, then there's a question of Tim Payne as well, who's now coming back into cricket and living your life in the glare of publicity. I think probably sports people may even get more scrutiny than politicians. They're always in the public, they're always accessible, and the headlines can be just extraordinary when things go wrong.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But what I was thinking about when you were speaking, Kieren, apart from the fish rots from the head expression, which is your point, Joe, about leadership having to set the tone for the rest of the organisation, what I was kind of concerned about is that there is this double standard between what we see in some of our sports leaders and what the standards are then applied on the athletes. And we have seen a real disconnect between some of our leaders in sport, in both Olympic sport and in professional sport, frankly, that is not reflected in what the expectations are on athletes. And I think that's really not okay. And perhaps that's what we've also seen in the Tim Payne scenario. Yeah, Hannah, of course, you lived through a very public story yourself as well. What's it like to be in the glare of that publicity and have your life debated by others?
Look, it's strange. It's very surreal. At the time, look, I didn't expect it. And I know people will look back and say, how can you not? But I really didn't. And it sort of just happened overnight. So I really didn't probably process it or realise what had happened for 3 or 4 years until it stopped. But I think too, the attention is there. But going back to the leadership side of things, and it's starting in the 4 walls of the home, I actually really think we need to apply that to, you know, sporting organisations in this instance, and the pressure and the expectations that are applied that are causing people to perhaps, you know, act out in ways they wouldn't otherwise. The ball tampering is a perfect example. And, you know, I said it with James Hird, I think, you know, we need to embrace failure more and accept that people make mistakes more, be they elite athletes or otherwise. Now, there's some things that, you know, you probably wouldn't want to give people a second chance for. I think David Warner absolutely should, because he's going to be a much better player in a leadership position now than he would have been before that from what he learnt. And I think we need to step back and realise that, you know, we can put this glare on people, but if they make mistakes as a result of that because of the pressure that's on them, well, perhaps we need to look at the culture that we're creating that's causing all of this. And I think we just need to embrace, when it comes to leadership, we need to embrace failure. Failing's great because you learn from it. I love it in moderated doses, you know. But it's the best thing you can do because you come out better for it. So I think, you know, we're very quick as a society to, you know, have one person make one mistake and that's it. And I think that's what we need to get past.
Cancel culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We've got a video question. It's coming from the Reverend Mafu Palu.
How do you define inclusivity in sports when players like Israel Folau and the Manly 7 are excluded from playing because they disagree with the homosexual and the rainbow agenda?
David.
Well, I'll answer that in 10 seconds flat, and then we'll end the show. There we go.
I don't think that's how it works.
It's a delicate dance, right? And it's because it's quite an emotive one for people. And we've got to understand that spirituality in sport is not new. From Eric Liddell in the 1920 Olympics, you know, that as depicted in Chariots of Fire, to Muhammad Ali nearly going to jail because of his his stance on Islamic beliefs, and refusing to be inducted into the US Army, to even more recently, Hainan Shreka at the AFLW, where she sat down with her teammates and asked or shared how she felt, and they supported her in not wearing the Pride jersey. So we've got to be careful that we treat instances as isolated cases, but look at the role of, I guess, spirituality or value system.
But it's where those values clash.
Yeah.
That's the point, right? In this case, 7 players said, I'm not going to wear it, and they didn't play. But the headlines went on for weeks, and there is this clash of whose values matter more.
And that's where it lies, is allowing that space for people to value what they prioritise in life. And I'm sure those players made the decision, to not cause any hurt or harm, but because they placed their value system, and when it clashed in the workplace, and there was a lack of consultation across all parties, and I'm one to we're quick to blame. It was the marketing department, it was the players, it was those aiming vitriol online. We've got to be careful here, because you just don't know what's in the heart and mind of someone who values, their value system. And I heard a lot that, it's a Pacific issue, it's a cultural issue, a religious issue. And for me, I felt it more being a humanistic issue of, well, how are we creating safe spaces for everyone who are involved?
But it was a religious issue, because a lot of the objection was on a religious grounds. Can I ask you directly, David, because you've been called in on this and you've been consulting and negotiating around this, though. If you were one of the players, Pacifica background, religious background, as indeed you come from, what would you have done? Would you have worn that jumper?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was thinking of that all day today. It's a tough question, because I'm Christian, I'm Pacific, and I have friends and family who identify in the LGBT community whom I love dearly. And so, to give you a hard and fast answer, I don't know. I would counsel with them first to say, this is how I'm feeling. I love you. I respect our friendship and compassion. How would you feel if I chose to wear it or not to wear it? And to ensure that...
That's a very political answer, David.
Yeah.
What would you do? I'm asking you right now. Here you are. You're one of the Manly players. This is what we're doing this weekend. We're wearing the Pride jumper. Are you going to wear it? Are you going to wear it?
I would check with my employer and those whom I love in my family, and to say, how are you feeling? As part of my employer, I'm okay to wear it, but not to make a statement, a political statement, but as a showing of love for you, because you're part of my family.
I think that was my confusion in all of this discussion, is why wasn't the starting position love? Why didn't we start and say, what is common here? The Christian faith talks about love, and what we're talking about when we want inclusion for sport is that we love and embrace those most marginalised and vulnerable in our community. So for me, it was an easy one, that the starting point is love and inclusion. But I found that very confusing, that there was such discourse in this way.
There was a brilliant video that I saw on Instagram by a guy called Josh Reed-Jones. And he said, whilst everybody jumps on what happened, and he didn't agree with the way things went down. And I'm not speaking for him, and I didn't agree with the way things went down. But what he said was, once we jump on people and completely banish them out of the conversation can't be had. Mm-hmm. So what we need to do is whilst ever we push people away from the conversation, you'll never see progress within those views.
Yeah, but there are questions, aren't there, Hannah, about whose views are heard and whose views matter more. And when you get a clash of religion, and I hear you, Catherine, you say you talk about love, but they also talk about sin. You talk about sin, Hannah, and that is a view that some of the players hold.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues for me anyway, and I think a lot of people, was the contradictions in that, and I use the example of, I think it was Will Hopewate, who a few years ago went on a Mormon mission and didn't play on Sundays. And I think for me personally, people were asking this question widely. Okay, the Bible also says don't do anything on Sunday, don't work on Sunday, don't get tattoos, don't do. And a lot of these players
get involved with gambling.
Sundays, they're doing all this stuff. They're sponsored by a gambling company. Why was it that the pride issue was the one that stuck out? They're happy to go against what is said in the Bible for all those other issues. Why this one? And I think it's the contradiction. So for me, using Will Hopoate as the example, he, wasn't playing on Sundays, went on his Mormon mission for 2 years. So I could totally understand if he came out and said, you know what, this is also against my beliefs, because he's been consistent. And you know what, everyone's going to disagree. I think, the pride jumper, like with you, Catherine, starts from a place of love. Just wear it, but that's my view. And I think, someone like Will Hopoate, I would be very open to going, okay, you know what? But you've been consistent. We can see it's not just this issue. I think the problem is people going, well, why is this the one issue? And why is it, whenever the LGBT community is brought into it, is that the issue? And I think that's what people really struggle with.
And
but
that's
also,
my concern too, is that this is about consenting adults in their own home, which doesn't impact anybody else's life. If you think about the comparison, which was really obvious because it was on the jersey, the gambling piece, then that's a massive issue for our community. We think it's normal in Australia that gambling is so ingrained in our sport and in our life, but it's not normal across the world. The rest of the world looks at Australia and says, what have you people done? The horse has bolted in terms of sports gambling and gambling in general, and it's a massive issue for us. So why is that okay when that impacts so many people?
As an administrator, Kieren, if you're running Sport Australia, what do you do in a situation like that? Whose rights do you give greater weight to? Why couldn't the players have that view and still be able to play? How would you rule on something like that?
Oh, look, it is fraught because they are employees, and I think that's one of the elements of this conversation, which is always a little bit challenging to navigate, because we throw out the term sport, but we don't actually acknowledge that some sports and entertainment industry that employs people to partake in that entertainment industry, and other activities are human beings trying to, for their own and their community's benefit, exceed at the highest level. Without reward more broadly. So that's a hard part, and because of that, I probably start a little bit more on the employee relations side of the argument, which is if you are employed to wear a uniform and that uniform requires certain things, then you've got to have an open conversation.
Does that mean so you can't play, you can't compete, you can't swim?
I think it can get to that point, but
well, it did get to that point, didn't it? Yeah. They didn't play.
The gap for me in the conversation and the way that went down, it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of open dialogue and consultation beforehand, because we can't have it both ways. We can't say on the one hand a certain segment of society's viewpoint is more important than another's, and not then actually take into account the social or moral hazard that comes with refusing to acknowledge another person's perspective. But I personally, when it really does get down to it, I fall on the side of humanity, and I think that the minute that you start trying to pick and choose which part of the human race you're willing to accept and embrace, then you're probably not going to be the right person to be employed in a leadership role like that.
So because of your faith and a faith-based objection to something, you can't play. You would make that decision?
Only in the context that if you refuse to engage and embrace in what the organisation was trying to deliver.
There's another aspect to this, David, and I wonder if you can clear this up for us, because we hear a lot about the religious aspect, and I also heard a lot about the cultural aspect. How do you work around that? There is a concept of VAR, as I understand, which is a respectful concept. There is also the Pacifica queer community, the FINA as well. Can you explain how that plays into this? Because that also seems to go to a bit of a contradiction, or it becomes more complex.
Yeah, that's a good question. And for those who aren't aware, the Pacific diaspora is a youthful and emerging population in Australia. It's important that we contextualise this, and quite often, very similar to the episode before, there's a stigmatisation of, say, Chinese Australians. It's the same with many cultural groups. There is this stigma attached to being a Pacific Islander in Australia, and I say it respectfully, often it's, oh, you're a footballer, an unskilled worker, and a labourer, and because we're heavily while it's only 1.5% of the population, make up 50% of professional rugby league and rugby union codes. Now, that's a huge disparity. Now, one could argue that's actually an overrepresentation based on the... but when it comes to executives, technical, coaching, administration, they're heavily underrepresented. Hence why, as a former employee of the league, I went down the academic route to unpack. So that's it contextually, but we also need to understand that being Pacific is ethnically diverse. 1,500 different languages, 25 different nations, and it's so easy to blanket cover being Pacific. And Hannah and I just had a really awesome conversation about Pacific culture, and queerness is nothing new in Pacific culture. You mentioned the FINA, which translates, it's the Samoan word for to be like a lady, or a whaatama, to be like a man. They're accepted in Pacific, or in Samoan culture, more so in Polynesian, less so in Melanesian countries such as Papua New Guinea, where there's a lot of gender inequality and empowerment, and the Solomon Islands. So we've got to contextualise that. That said, in the Samoan culture, anyway, the whawhawhine is accepted, is celebrated, plays a valuable part in society.
And yet some of these players were saying, I'm not going to wear this jumper. So how do we square that circle, if you like, if there is a religious objection, but there's also a cultural aspect?
Yeah. I don't know if it needs necessarily squaring in terms of right or wrong, yes or no. I think it's important to understand that people with spirituality have varying degrees of beliefs or practicing levels, and we've got to be careful that we're not blanketing that all Christians practice a certain way, especially when recent census data shows that 60 years ago, 90% of our population identified as Christian, as last year it said, I think we're only around 43%. And 39% identified as no religion. And so there's this juncture occurring in our Australian society in terms of spirituality, if you will, and how that plays out. But in terms of Pacific culture, those varying degrees of practice and belief plays out differently for different communities and different athletes, different families. So we've just got to be careful. And as a Pacific Christian person myself, I don't speak for all Pacific people. I don't speak for all Christians. And even though I hold a PhD, it's a license for me to say, I want to learn more. I'm keen to learn more. I want to respect more. I want to embrace more. And so it's a delicate experience.
Well, we're here to learn. We're here to understand. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Kieren Perkins, Hannah Mouncey, Joe Williams, Catherine Ordway and David Lakisa. This is where we talk about what's on your mind. And I want to bring in Australian weightlifting Commonwealth Games gold medalist and Olympian Deborah Lovely Ackerson in Brisbane. It's good to see you, Deborah. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
We're moving on to another part of the conversation, and there's a lot of debate over the question of inclusion of trans athletes in sport. Now, you've competed against a trans female athlete. What was your experience?
Yeah, so, I joined the sport at the age of 14 and spent 20 years moving right through from club, state, national through to international level. I got the ability to compete at 2 Olympic Games and 5 Commonwealth Games. And, as you can imagine, along the way, there's lots of obligations, on an elite athlete to ensure fairness in competition. For my sport, you have a weigh-in and you've got to weigh a certain amount, otherwise you don't get to compete. There's drug tests, there's gender tests that I had to undergo before competing in a World Junior competition. There's even blood tests to make sure that there's no doping violations there. So really every step of the way as an elite athlete is really constant requirements to adhere to ensure fairness. And of course I'm happy to comply because, I want to compete.
Well, what happened in this instance? Because you competed against Laurel Hubbard from New Zealand, a trans female athlete who was competing in the Commonwealth Games against you. What happened in that event? Yeah,
so leading into my 5th Commonwealth Games, it really felt like the goalpost had moved for me. It was supposed to be the sort of the highlight of my career, I suppose. It was the first time I got to compete in front of my entire family and friends, my support crew. And as a mum, that was a really important moment for me to compete in front of my 2 daughters as well. And I suppose for me, with fairness being so important. It felt like in that moment lining up against Laurel Hubbard, to be presented for this competition didn't feel fair. So after, 20 years of jumping through the hoops and ensuring I'd done everything I needed to do to be an elite athlete, lining up against a transgender athlete just really felt at odds with what I had gone through for 20 years to ensure fairness in competition. I also was advised very strongly not to compete, not to comment on my feelings prior to the competition.
How did the competition pan out? Now, Laurel Hubbard, as I understand, didn't complete in the tournament. You did. How did that competition head-to-head turn out?
Yeah, so look, I wasn't ranked as highly. I actually went into the competition ranked 8th. And in the end, as it does in weightlifting competitions, if you miss all your lifts, you don't get a total. So I actually placed 4th in that competition, which I was pretty happy about. But yeah, Laurel was injured in that competition.
Hannah?
Yep.
Yeah. No, just I mean, you've been through this experience. You were excluded from AFL. You're now playing handball. But when you hear that there was a question of fairness, if we go to that question of fairness, how do you answer that?
My question would be, how much do you understand about what happens to a person's body when they go through that transition? That's where I would start at as the first point, because I can't really address it without knowing how much knowledge is there at the moment.
Explain that to us, because we perceive with our eyes. We so much of what we take from the world is visual. You're a big person, and someone who looks at you is going to think you've got an advantage. Explain why you don't.
Yeah, so what happens when you transition, and this will take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to explain, so hopefully everyone can stay with me. But what happens, you initially go on testosterone blockers and estrogen. Testosterone is a huge driver in muscle, muscle building, strength production, anything that it creates the difference between men and women. And what happens when you transition? You eliminate that altogether. So trans women have less testosterone than cisgender women in their system, whatever stage of the transition they're at. And the effects are very, very rapid. And what happens is, I can tell you in the first 2 months, I lost about 20 kilos.
You lost about 20 kilos?
Yep, I was big. My job was to be big, playing handball, and I still play. And that happened in about 8 weeks, but then it stopped very, very suddenly. And the reason that happened is because your body needs muscle to survive. Your body knows that that's happening, it thinks it's dying, and it does whatever it can to preserve it. But having said that, the main driver of, and in this instance, strength is what we're talking about in this, not this, even specifically this conversation with weightlifting, but that seems to be what everyone's talking about. The effect on your nervous system continues unabated at the same rate that it was happening and affecting, the outside appearance, but it continues. And I think, for anyone acquainted with sport knows that the nervous system is what creates strength. It is responsible for a whole range of issues. Muscles are the side effect of training. And so what you end up have at the end of it is someone who possibly looks quite a bit bigger than, they are strong. And what they can do doesn't match up with the outside.
That's a hard thing to understand. Is it a hard thing to understand that someone looks bigger than they are strong? It's a lie. It's a hard thing. You say, well, let's go to Ada Chung. Ada, you work in this. You're an endocrinologist. Take us through this. How can someone appear to be strong but actually not be strong?
Yeah, I am a clinician scientist, so I am an endocrinologist. I treat trans people as a doctor, and I do research in transgender health to try and understand hormone therapy. And so I think people are very quick to make assumptions. What is clear is males have a performance advantage over females. What isn't clear is what happens to trans women after they start feminising hormone therapy. And so we know that, it is the science behind the impact of feminising hormones on physical performance is not definitive whatsoever. In medicine, I'm very pro making evidence-based decisions. And, the gold standard when it comes to scientific evidence is a randomised controlled trial. That doesn't exist in transgender health.
So what you're telling me is the science is out, so we don't know.
Yeah, so what we have is some small cohort studies where groups of transgender people have been followed over time, and we have some cross-sectional studies, so a snapshot in time, where trans people on feminising hormones have been compared to cisgender men and cisgender women. And so based on the limited evidence, what we do know is that trans women lose muscle mass over time. How long this occurs for, we don't know. They gain fat mass and they drop their hemoglobin, which is an oxygen carrying capacity of the red blood cells. And that happens within 3 months. And there's only been one research study assessing physical performance in transgender. I'm talking mainly about women because transgender women are at the subject of debate. And this is a retrospective study looking at transgender women in the Air Force who had fitness data.
Can I come in there? Because I've looked at this study, and yes, it showed that there was a decrease in power, and after a couple of years there was no discernible difference, except for this, that transgender women were faster.
Yep.
They maintained an advantage when it came to speed.
Yep.
A not insignificant one, around about 12%.
So, you know, there was certainly, when it looked at sit-ups performed in 1 minute and push-ups performed in 1 minute, by 2 years, transgender women were no different to cisgender women. But for the 1.5 mile run, transgender women remained faster than cisgender women. So there may be a biological advantage, I'm not denying that, but there may also be a biological disadvantage. So when you look at speed and running time, you also have to adjust for height. So the transgender women were about 10 centimetres taller than the cisgender women cohort. And in sport, we typically don't discriminate based on height.
But that's still an advantage. I'm trying to get my head around this because we're dealing with science, you're trying to deal with controlled groups. There are different studies and different studies finding different things. We know the science is not in. And that we've established. But we've got two male athletes here. If you can stand up, Joe and Kieren. Could I ask you to stand up, Joe? Kieren?
It's a loose term, athlete.
You're more of an athlete than me, mate. So you're a gold medalist. Joe and Kieren, male athletes performing at a high level. Gold medalist, boxing champion, rugby league player. After 2 years of going through the type of therapy that you're outlining, the hormone therapy, would they not still have the physical advantages that they have had from a lifetime of training and playing and competing at the highest level?
The science isn't clear. So we don't know whether there's a biological advantage or a biological disadvantage. Like someone
Kieren's got an advantage on me in height, and I say you can swim a lot better than me.
Someone who's taller is going to be able to run faster. They've got longer legs. But the power driving Kieren compared to before he started feminising hormone therapy, is going to be a lot different. So I often give the analogy that, you know, if you imagine a four-wheel drive powered by a hatchback engine, the quick assumption will be, oh, that four-wheel drive is stronger. But, you know, in reality, you know, the function may be actually less. And there's been some preliminary research. There's very little research in trans health, but there's a study looking at VO2 max, which is maximum oxygen uptake relative to fat-free mass. And when they looked at transgender women as a cross-section compared to cisgender men and cisgender women, transgender women had a lower index than both cisgender men and cisgender women. Now, this is a small abstract.
They're small numbers as well.
They're very small numbers.
Can I just add, though, because there's a lot that's still to be addressed with this, and I need to make the point too, and I think they're pretty obvious ones, is that at the moment, you know, we're looking at size and strength as the biggest things. That only affects a small number of sports where that would be an advantage. And so I always use the example, I would be a horrific gymnast. I'd be a terrible marathon runner, diver, you name it. Anything that requires agility, I'm out. And so, you know, also in the discussions that I had, trans people are never asked. You know, a lot of the time, and I did this with the AFL, that I presented my data to them, I gave them what I had, but because it's anecdotal or because it's from me, they automatically rule it out. And I can tell people that, you know, within that time period that you were talking about, you know, the weight loss and the muscle loss I've already spoken about, but within the 12 months, which was the IOC recommendation at the time, my squat went from 200 kilos down to about 70. My bench press went from 150 to 60. And my clean went from 140 down to about 60 as well. So that's pretty significant.
We've still got Deborah here with us, and I want to come back to you in a second, Deborah. We've got another question on this. Let's keep the discussion going. Camellia Ling Arbisha.
Thanks. My question's for Kieren. Kieren, you condemned the FINA ban on transgender athletes for being blunt and inelegant. How would you have approached this issue if you had to make a call?
Well, the first thing that I guess I get personally frustrated with in this discussion is we are all sitting here having this conversation as though there is this enormous wave of human beings who are about to wipe out elite sport in the globe, and it is completely, utterly false.
So far.
And no, it's false. And the thing that I also get concerned about, and I've lived this, is that when a group like FINA makes a determination the way that they did, which was not based in science, whether they claim that it was or not, but it's not, because there is not the science to make a definitive call. They've made a rule to ban an entire segment of society based on their fear that one athlete could possibly maybe one day potentially do okay.
But it happened after one particular case, Leah Thomas in the United States, who won by quite a way a college swim event.
She also lost a number by quite a way.
Yeah, she did, but she did win. So
it was a 50-yard event, though. We should just make that clear. It's not an Olympic event.
She wasn't in the frame for selection. She would never have made the American team.
But it certainly rang alarm bells enough for FINA. What would you do? That was the question.
So what I would do is actually acknowledge and understand that the leadership position FINA has taken has impacted society at large. So the thing that I have to deal with as an administrator that is trying to increase the inclusion and the volume of human beings that are involved in physical activity is acknowledge and recognise that the minute FINA made their decision, I saw evidence of people immediately saying, fantastic, so we can just wipe them, transgenders, no more in sport at all. And I've got evidence of that conversation going on. And that is my worst fear proliferated on what that would happen, because Deborah, at a community level, it's unacceptable.
I need to bring Deborah
Elite's
back
Elite's another conversation.
And Deborah's talking about elite. And you said, Deborah, you have concerns for your own children. You'd like to see them compete. Take us through those concerns. And just respond as well to the science that we heard from Ada and what we've heard from Kieren.
I'm just very confused with people saying that there's no science to back up the fact that a biological male would have a residual advantage over a female athlete. A male athlete, a biological male athlete, doesn't have to train 1 week different every month due to a menstrual cycle. When you look at a 4-year cycle for the Olympic Games, that's 1 year out of every 4 years that a female athlete has to adjust their training. That's significant on its own. Concerns in terms of my children, I've got 3 daughters. That's really why I want to speak on this topic, because apart from the fact that I'm probably one of the very few people in their room that has competed against a transgender athlete and actually knows what that feels like, I have 3 daughters of my own that I do want them to compete at a high level. If they don't, that's fine, but I do want them to participate safely and fairly in sport. And I think that we need to remember that our elite female athletes come from a grassroots level. And so we need to make sure that there is fun, that there is safety, and that there is fairness in that. I also coach my middle child in soccer. And at the age of 5 and 6, I can see the difference in physicality with not all, but quite a lot of the young boys that play in the team, a mixed team with the young girls. And by the age of about 8 to 10 years old, quite a lot of the young girls are not wanting to continue participation in that sport because of fear for, maybe not fear is the right word, but because of the concern of the physicality of playing with boys at the age of 8 to 10 years old.
Can I just say, though, that there's a lot of issues there, and that is you're saying that they don't want to compete against the boys. How many of those boys that you're talking about have been through a process of transition to female so it can be an accurate comparison?
So, sorry, I didn't say that they don't want to compete against boys. Yeah. I'm saying that they start to find, I notice, a difference in physicality from quite a young age. So I'm not about excluding people, but I am really about fairness. And
that seems to be the question. Can I ask people in the room, it's hard when there's so much information swirling around, but if you came in tonight with a particular view and whether you might have changed that view, how do you feel about inclusion and fairness? Did you come in tonight thinking that that people should be excluded and you've changed your mind? Hand up. No, only one. If you came in tonight and thought that yes, people should be included and now they should be excluded. Hands up. No, very few. So people are still processing the information. We're going to have to move on because we do have a lot of other things to talk about. Deborah, thank you so much for joining us. It's been good to have you on the program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stan, can I just pose something to Catherine?
Can we just, we'll have to just move on, sorry.
Yeah, sure.
We can maybe come back to it another time. But if this discussion is raising any difficulties for you or anyone you know, the numbers for Lifeline, Q Life and the Kids Helpline are there on your screen. Let's hear now from Apurva Sharma.
Thanks, Dan. My question is addressed to the panel. As a big advocate of diversity, inclusion and equal representation, I want to know what has been done so far to address the lack of diversity amongst the people running sports organisations?
Joe?
Not enough. In a simple statement, not enough. And we look at in inclusion, and we look at diversity as a person of colour that's been involved in sport for a long part of my life. We see a hell of a lot, as David alluded to, we see a hell of a lot of people of colour in the rugby league and rugby union, but we don't see a hell of a lot of people of colour making the decisions at the top. That's where we need to get to a position in this country where, when we're talking about inclusion, it's not just the parrots out on the field that are there for the entertainment. Let's look at some people that are moving through these different positions of decision making within games. Whether it be coaching, whether it be into leadership positions within sport as well. I think it's a must. And if we're going to have serious conversations about that, it needs to start happening.
David, you mentioned before, I think around 50% of the National Rugby League Pacifica, another 10-12% are Indigenous players, but we don't see that at coaching, at administration, running clubs, running the NRL. Why?
Yeah, that's a really good question about diversifying one's workforce. We've got to be careful again that they're not tokenistic appointments. Just on the way here, my cab driver, proud Indian cricketer, and we started talking about cricket, but we talked about representation, about from the playing field to in executive roles. But more than just representation, there's got to be competency, and those pathways are absolutely critical. Especially...
Are they there?
Slowly. They're being progressive, but it hasn't moved quickly enough, particularly in the First Nations space. We're finding and creating pathways to executive training. But you've got to be careful that people aren't just, I want a role for the sake of a role. It's got to be, it's got to work organically, be authentically.
Kieren, you're a white man running sport. Are you part of the problem?
100%.
So why'd you take the job?
Because I'd like to think I can make a difference, and part of that difference is pointing out that what's been said, I agree with. There is not an appropriate representation at executive, coaching and administrative levels.
What are you doing to make sure the person who comes after you is not another white man?
Well, also though, can I just make the point, separate to the professional sports though, if you look at our non-professional sports, our player cohort is also not even remotely representative of the community that exists in Australia today. So there's an enormous amount of work to do. And look, the Sports Commission, we run programs to uplift and elevate people, to provide them with the skills and the capability. But the biggest change that needs to occur, if I'm honest, I think, is that the dialogue around what the opportunity then leads to. It's no good training people and giving them all the skills if there's no job at the end of it, because the people who continue to exist in the positions of power and leadership don't then actually open the door to a role opportunity or allow for broader representation. And it's one of the areas, I've been in this job 5 months now, and I've only been back in sport for a couple of years. My professional career in corporate Australia, I was shocked when I came back into sport and saw actually just how far behind sport was in terms of the community's expectations and the behaviours we see in other organisations.
Another topic that's on your mind, and it comes from June Hopley. June?
Yes.
Oh, there you are.
Yes. I don't like sports culture at all. I've seen and heard things, sexist and racist comments, behaviours that have really shredded me emotionally, and I'm only a bystander. So I just can't imagine what that means for players. So I guess I wanted to direct this to Joe. for the players, do you think players that are subjected to these traumatic racist slurs from bystanders in the name of a good day out at the game, do you think they're still expected to just shrug off this sort of racism? Are things changing?
I get asked this question all the time. Does the NRL have a problem with racism? Does the AFL have a problem with racism? I believe Australia has a problem with racism.
Yep.
You know, sport is a byproduct of a larger country, right? Let's look at what racism does. Are players expected to just shrug it off? Let's look at the actual, the impact and effects of what racism is, and in alerting our stress response in our brain and everything that happens during that process of being targeted, racially vilified, takes us directly back to years and decades of our mothers and fathers and grandparents being flogged and raped and bashed, you know, just for being coloured. You know, so that impact is a direct relationship, or takes us back directly to those times.
How do you deal with it, Joe, when it happens on the field to you?
I'm lucky that to me and for me is that I've got a. I would like to class myself as someone who's, what's the term they say, emotionally intelligent around that sort of stuff. I know if I go and knock someone's teeth out, who gets in trouble. Everything inside me wants to do that, but I'm lucky that I've got a fast process within my mind that I can pull myself away from that. And something that my father once said to me, he said, "You'll never beat racism with your fist, Joe." Because of, and this was on the back of, you know, some violent episodes by me as a youngster, being called XYZ. He said, "You'll never ever beat racism with your fist. You'll only ever beat racism with intelligence and the truth." And what I've come to see in my, I don't like to say it on national television, almost 39 years of life, is that racists aren't overly intelligent. So when you start to hit them with the truth and the facts, you actually expose their lack of intelligence, and you actually expose just how insignificant they are.
And I have to say, Stan, I think it's also worth mentioning, Stan, and it comes back to also the leadership question that we posed right at the very start of this, because Joe's right, sport is a symptom of society, it is not the maker of society. However, we do have a leadership position to take, and I think more parts of the sporting system actually need to be a lot more vocal and open about the behaviours they will and won't accept and deal with it.
Where's that failing, Catherine? Because it persists. The Eddie Betts book recently revealed what he went through. We've seen Collingwood go through this several times. We heard the Adam Goodes affair. You talk a lot, June, about community sport, and understand you've seen it at community sport level. So why? Where is the failure here?
Yeah, you're 100% correct. Community sport is rife with both racism directed at players and referees, coaches, everyone. But the intersectionality of that against women is so disproportionate. It's out of control, actually, in community sport, and it's a real concern. I wondered whether you and David and Joe had any idea about, any thoughts about what it is about sport that seems to give people a licence to behave in a way that you won't see them behaving when they're at the supermarket or in the street or whatever. It seems to be something that allows people to do it.
We see it every day in the looks that we get, the microaggressions, the looks that we get, the way that we're treated, the person in the car or the person at the counter serving the white person before they serve the coloured person. We see it every day. This isn't a sport issue. This is an Australia issue. The thing is, people don't realise what this country in 1788 was birthed on. It was birthed on racism. And the fact that we live it now in everything that we do and everywhere that we're exposed to is that we are remnants. No, any wonder that we're dying 10 years younger than non-Indigenous Australians is because of the impact of stress that it's having on our people, that it's having on our direct health outcomes. When we're going to talk about closing the gap, we're going to talk about race in closing the gap as well, and the challenges that we have with race in this country.
We're talking about mental health. Let's hear from Bethany Yong as well.
So researchers found that 44% of Premier League players who hold a Twitter account have received abuse. This is just one example of how social media abuse is taking its toll on players. What has been done to stamp out online abuse, and what more do you think can be done?
David, there was a Pacifica player playing for South Sydney who has had death threats online precisely because of this, and just because he had a bad game. What is being done?
Yeah. It's a really good question. Jackson Polo, a young Pacific Samoan man with all that vitriol aimed at him, and many decide that's just sport, so I shouldn't take it personally, but are encouraged, no, you need to take it further and get the police involved and so forth. So
the E-Safety Commissioner now, we have two also who can help.
Yeah, and so ensuring that there is strong support structures and there are clear guidelines on how to manage, because it's only going to become more and more rife, and especially you've mentioned the Premier League statistic. I'd like to see, like Joe was alluding to, there's a more dominant discourse at play here of the negativity and online abuse outside of sport.
But what happens to a young kid though, like Jackson Paulo? He's there having to deal with it. You work with the NRL. What's done to help a young boy like that?
Well, fortunately, they have the NRL Wellbeing Education Department do a wonderful job ensuring that the players, whether it's at the club level or at a game level, are supported through counselling. But we're finding that individuals and their own entourage, if you will, their own support network, we're finding those who already have that foundational support network, that base, we're finding, I won't say they're more resilient, but they're able to rely on that support networks because I think, Kieren, you alluded to that becoming a professional athlete, that it's expected to be in that space, which is a sad reality, but to be training them while they're young. And so when it does happen, because it more often than not will happen, that they are prepared in some way, shape or form.
The challenge is there's no consequences.
Yeah.
Right? There's no consequences to words online or even words, said to me. But, I've read a study and it was documented in, I'm pretty sure it was by Dr. Bruce Perry, when he talked about the impact of racism, direct overt racism to somebody is like the toxic stress that it causes on the brain to somebody is like getting a punch in the face.
Catherine,
if somebody punched somebody in the face, they'd have consequences for it. But if somebody has racial tones or even language towards someone, there's no consequences.
Catherine, you write in this space, you work in this space, and you get also this type of abuse on Twitter, don't you? How do you deal with it?
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to pick up on how big the issue is in terms of racism because of research that we did that was trying to understand what falls into this massive bucket that we call sports integrity. And so we did some research looking at the media over a 10-year period, 2009 to 2019, and we expected that what would be coming up all the time was doping issues and match fixing issues, that kind of standard sports integrity. But actually racism was the number one issue. And we thought during that period maybe this has been skewed because of so much commentary around Adam Goodes and all that was happening there. So we actually removed all the media articles that mentioned him as well, and it still came out as the number one issue. And we were really shocked by that's how it was being presented.
What I question is why is the bias there to think that it's not an issue?
Not that we didn't think it was an issue.
It's not an attack on you. That's not what I'm getting at.
But the number one issue, that's how it's being presented in the media, was really fascinating when you use the term together with sports integrity, I mean. So traditionally, that's because over the last 30 years it's been doping and match fixing.
An indication of how prevalent it is. We're going to finish tonight's conversation with a question from Tabitha Rickard.
Hi. Currently, there's still some clubs and community sporting groups from grassroots through to professional competitions that are still continuing to exclude unvaccinated people, even though the mandates have dropped. Why are we not talking about the prejudice and the stigma that is currently surrounding these people who've just survived 10, 11 months of being physically excluded and discriminated, like in a way that we have not seen in Australia for a long, long time, or if ever before? How do we encourage this minority group back into sport, and what does the future look like for the unvaccinated community?
A question from the lockdown capital of Australia, if not the world. Catherine.
It's a really difficult one, and I think from a professional sport perspective, they've really grappled with this. So this is a really great question from the community level, because I agree with you. People are not thinking about it and they're not talking about it. And in the same way that we started out by saying that the most marginalised, vulnerable people in the community need love and to be embraced by sport, then that is exactly the conversation we need to be having at the community level. At the professional level, of course, as Kieren mentioned, this is an employment contract situation, and you can set what the rules are in an employment relationship, but in community sport, we should be saying, everyone, let's play.
What do you do at a professional level, Kieren?
Oh, look, we actually struggled with this just recently at the Commonwealth Games, because obviously the Australian team took a very extreme view and was managing COVID and infection at its extreme end. I'm not sure that there was a mandate, though. I'd have to check on that. Whereas the rest of the world absolutely did not in any way acknowledge, care, or even bother with dealing with COVID. So I think we need to move forward. In a high-performance environment where you have one opportunity to compete at one time, we want to give the best protection we can to ensure that everybody doesn't lose that opportunity. But at a community level, I can't see that there is any reason for this to be a problem.
What are we going to do with Novak Djokovic? Should he be let back in for the Australian Open? What do you think?
Let him back in.
Let him back in?
Hands up.
Hands up? Let him back in? Keep Novak Djokovic out? Oh, the outs win. Sorry, Novak. That's all we've got time for. Thanks again to our panel, Kieren Perkins, Hannah Mouncey, Joe Williams, Catherine Ordway and David Lakisa. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us here, for bringing your questions and getting involved in the conversation and driving that conversation. Thanks to you at home as well. Next week we're live in Sydney, and joining me to answer your questions, British philosopher and writer AC Grayling, Finance Minister Katie Gallagher, Shadow Assistant Treasurer Stuart Robert and Agribusiness Leader Catherine Marriott. Do head to our website. You can register to be in the audience, and you can catch me on China Tonight on Monday at 9:35. Good night. Thank you.